All right, good afternoon, everyone. Those of you awake and would like to enjoy something different from model making and laser cutting and such, welcome to the next lecture in our series. And today we are in treat with a fantastic talk from Anijo Punnen Mathew. Dr. Mathew is from Illinois Institute of Technology, Institute of Design. Okay. And it's a world-renowned institute, it's a school, and he is currently teaching there in the design program. He teaches in the Master of Design in particular, and as well as other graduate programs that they have there. His educational background is quite interesting and varied. His undergraduate degree is from a very elite school in India called Birla Institute of Technology, and then he went to Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he has a Master of Design Studies degree, and then he did his PhD in computing from United Kingdom's Open University. And he is now the Associate Professor of Design. He and I have a lot of collaboration in common at the Association for Computer Design in Architecture. It's an international association, and that's where I got to learn about his exciting work, groundbreaking work, and very innovative work. And I have learned a lot from him, and I'm pretty sure we'll all be learning a lot from him and all the exciting work that he has been doing there and around the world, actually. In fact, he has worked with a number of companies and schools, meaning schools of architecture, firms of design, and things like, I think Motorola would be one example. The city of Chicago is another example. Then he is working with very large multinational corporations around the world as well to take the value of design thinking, design methodologies in order to address the highest level of issues facing many organizations across sectors. And this is exciting also because we are always used to thinking about design as serving just only one end, that is to produce objects and buildings. But here we see a very broad spectrum of application of design thinking and methods and frameworks from designers that are applied to very innovative situations. So I think that's where our eyes will be open to other possibilities and to realize the value actually of what we all do on a daily basis, might not just realize it, but really push it in a very rigorous direction. So that's with that introduction, and without further ado, I'd like to invite a very warm Ball State College of Architecture and Planning welcome to Anijo Punnen Mathew.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And I have deep-rooted connections to this place, even though I haven't actually physically been here before. When I started off as a young assistant professor, one of the people who actually allowed me to do that is sitting here. And then over time, there are several people who mentored me through the progress as I moved through my own career. So for those of you who are tweeters, if you are tweeting, that's my tweet handle, right? So just in case you are tweeters. I also realize that this is probably the worst day in the year to be here, right? But then Andrew suggested maybe I should have gotten cupcakes and handed it out to people as bribes to come for this. But I think you'll be in for a treat anyway. So Mahesh already did this. My degree is in architecture. I have a degree in architecture from India and went to the Graduate School of Design. Spent a lot of time at MIT looking at technology, went through the Open University, did computing. So you'll see one of the things that I bring to the design school, which is not a school of architecture, is the merger of these three disciplines, architecture, technology, and computing. Now this is going to become important as we go through the presentation, so keep that in mind. I am at the IIT Institute of Design. The Institute of Design, how many of you guys know about the Institute of Design? Or at least have heard about it? Okay. Oh, that's pretty cool. Usually that number is like 2, right? One of it is me. So the Institute of Design is a 75-year-old school. It was started, the interesting history of the school is Walter Gropius, when he was coming to the US, was asked to chair the program at the school called the Chicago New Bauhaus, was what it was called, right? When Gropius was moving from Bauhaus to the US. But of course, Gropius had already taken up his position at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and so he suggested a second person who could do it, called Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. You may not know this name, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, but in the Bauhaus, this was one of the most important names because he basically structured design thinking in the 1930s. Right? So it's pretty amazing. Now, here's the problem. When Moholy-Nagy came to the US, he was in direct competition with another crazy guy who came from Germany called Mies van der Rohe. Right? So these guys hated each other, and they were constantly fighting in Chicago. So the history of the school goes back, so we were put in the basement of Crown Hall for a long time, and then we moved out of it. So there's this very, very storied history if you're interested. Anyway, that's not what we are here to talk about. At the Institute of Design, remember I'm an architect? What I look at is the intersection of 3 relationships. I look at the relationship between people and people, people and objects, and increasingly objects and objects. Now the last one is very important. As objects become more sentient and intelligent, that relationship is going to take precedence in many people's head over the first 2, whether we like it or not. Right? So your Roomba talking to your house is going to carry as much meaning as you talking to another person. So at the Institute of Design, I look at this from the mediation of technology. So anytime these conversations are mediated through technology, I am interested. Right? Now, here's the issue. Throughout our design education, we have been taught that the object or the artifact is where all the magic is. It contains, we were just talking about this, right? Political, social, economic, and technological context is contained within the artifact, and the user simply comes into it. Now, you guys are familiar with this, because when you take photographs of your built structures, or you go out and become famous architects, and you will take photographs, this is the kind of photograph you will take. Amazing, right? Except the reality of the situation is the artifact is merely just a player in a large system of interactions, which includes the user. And as a designer, you, by designing the artifact, are also designing the user and every other part of that system. And it's a complex relationship. You cannot derive it or construct it simply into the artifact. So what does this mean for architecture? For those of you who know Dwell magazine, they created pretty much a big ruckus in the architectural field when they started printing photographs with people in them. People living in houses. This is what we build our spaces for. In the absence of the human narrative, without the human narrative, places have no meaning. Does this make sense? This room is only a space if you don't occupy it. It becomes a place, it becomes an artifact of importance because you're here. Otherwise, it's just 4 walls, just a bunch of chairs. You derive or you create meaning to this place, right? So what does this mean? Let me try to explain. Let me try to break it down into 2 different components. What is space? Space is merely a geographic layer. It is a latitude and longitude. It is a structural element that makes up our spaces, our physical embodiment, right? So you're here, the four walls, the position that this building takes in the latitude and longitude of Muncie, Indiana, that is space. Place, on the other hand, is an emotional layer. It's built of memories and experiences. This is what we design. I don't go home to my house. I go home to my house with my daughter. I go home to her jumping on the sofa. Right? That's what I go home for. How many of you are going to your house for Thanksgiving? How many of you are going home for Thanksgiving? Do you see the difference? That is the difference between space and place. Right? And that's what we design. We design place. And what is place? Well, let's break it down. First, there is the material layer. This is the layer that we love to design, right? This is the layer. This is a project by Andrew Cudlis, one of our colleagues at Acadia. It's brilliant. It's formed concrete. So beautiful. Yes? Yet, this is the layer that makes human life exciting. The submaterial layer. This is what we live for. The photographs we take, the stories we tell, the narratives we construct, the lives we live within that formed concrete. That formed concrete is nothing without this woman. The place layer is in between these two things. So here's my proposition. My first proposition, which it says proposition number 2, is information is material. Even though we may not like it, even though we may not think of it as material, it is material. Think about how you consume place. How many of you guys have been to Chicago? How many of you start to think about Chicago in terms of just buildings? How many of you think of Chicago as a place that you exist in? How many of you construct that narrative through information? Right? Does anyone recognize this project? Has anyone seen this project? Can you take a guess at what that is? This was an art project that was done some time ago. If you look down, you can actually see the name of the project and what it is. So this is a person who went around the city and tracked and mapped Wi-Fi networks. What is Chicago made up of? Is it made up of bricks? Is it made up of steel? Is it made up of glass? Or is it made up of all that and things like memories and Wi-Fi networks and things you cannot see? Right? Imagine an architecture where all of that is visible. Imagine an architecture that looks like this, where Wi-Fi networks, based on the strength, is visible to you, and you move through these networks, just like you move through them invisibly. So what is place? Place, when you think about it, is the intersection, well, I like to think of it this way, of the three things that I studied, right? Place, technology, and social. And at this intersection, something amazing is happening. How many of you, when you go to Chicago, think of Chicago as just buildings, right? We are digitally documenting more information than ever before in our human existence. We are creating place from this. The things that you take to create place. Right? Eventually, we are all going to walk around like this. At least some of us are. Right? I might. Does everyone recognize the product? That's Google Glass. What does Google Glass do? For Google, it's probably going to be a failure, right? It's going to fail. But for us, it changes the way we think about technology. We are no longer interacting with places like this. We are interacting with places like this. And it changes the way we think about place. There's other technology that's coming up. Android Wear, watches. Have you guys heard of this? Or seen this? What is it? Estibot. What does an Estibot do? What does it do that GPS doesn't do? It positions it to 3 inches of fidelity. What that means is not only do I know that you have entered Neiman Marcus, I know which shoe you're looking at. Last year, these guys released these little kiwi-sized objects and made them stickers. You can put these stickers on practically anything, everything out there. What does that mean for architecture? What does that mean for design? When everything can be constructed with information. There is a group in England who teach at RCA called Dunn and Raby. Have you guys heard of Dunn and Raby? So these guys propose something impressive. They say that even though we like to think that as human beings, we move in physical space, think of Chicago and you moving through Chicago. The reality is we move through 2 different types of spaces at the same time. Physical space and Hertzian space. Every time that you're walking around in physical space, your virtual embodiment is constructed and moving with you. Your Facebook profile, your Twitter feed, your emails, your, that little avatar that you created on that site that you don't want to talk about to anyone. All of those things are moving with you and constructing its own experience. We have constructed as a community Hertzian space around us. No longer can we claim that we live purely in the real realm anymore. No individual on earth can claim that they live in the real realm only. Depending on where you are and how much access you have to technology, you live on this continuum somewhere. And there are multiple instances of you on this continuum. There's a real you, there's a fully synthetic you, and there's something in between. Right? This is a scary thought, but it is real. This is the reality that we live in. This is the reality that we are designing for. And then what does this mean? It means that we have to start rethinking what we do. Right? So what we do at ID is start to think about what the process is for doing this. So you guys are familiar with this, I think. I've heard this repeated at the school, that you cannot think simply of what is viable and what is feasible. You also have to think about what is desirable. So it's not enough to think why something can work or how it will work. You must also think about who will derive value out of it. To give you an example, what we do is we think of user-centered design thinking. Right? And what does this mean? User-centered design thinking means that you cannot take the problem as a given. You always have to reframe the problem one step. So, some time ago, Larry and I wrote a paper in which we talked about this. We say the problem that a designer faces when you guys are designing something is very complex. It's something really difficult to do. Not only must you come up with the design, you must visualize, you must evaluate, and you must communicate that design. Except, here's the problem, that design isn't real yet. It is yet to be real, but is not yet real. This is a very complex problem, right? What happens because of this is that we take our preconceived notions of what that design should be and construct that into the artifact. Does anyone know what this is? One laptop per child. This is the one laptop per child project. When it was conceived at MIT, Nicholas Negroponte had this vision in his head that you could take this beautifully designed product, yes, it's a beautifully designed product, put it into helicopters. Because it is so cheap, it's only $100, you could take the helicopter and put it over India and China and Africa, drop these laptops from the sky, kids could pick it up and use it, just like that. Brilliant idea, except this is where they were using it. What's wrong with the picture? Where is it? Come on, you guys can't be that tired. Where is it? India. What's wrong with the picture? No power. This was one of the biggest problems that they did not consider. Then they did something brilliant. They came up with a crank. You could crank it to create power, except the crank never worked, but that's okay. But you could create power, right? What's the second biggest problem? Look at exactly. How much do you think this family makes in a year? Probably $100. What do you think happened to the laptops? They got stolen, the kids got mugged, the family would sell it. This is the problem with design. We think of the artifact without thinking of the context that the artifact will be placed in. So we need to rethink the problem. How do you rethink it? Well, one of the things that we are taught is that you look at what's out there and you create something better than that. The problem with that is that if you're P&G, you are always going to make the next best detergent. So you're going to come up with the better chemical composition, you're going to come up with better bottles to use that detergent in, you come up with brilliant ideas about how that bottle is going to be designed, but you're never asking the question about what do people use the detergent for? So when we went to P&G, we said, how do you reframe it? Well, one reframe is, instead of asking how do you use a detergent, ask how do people wash their clothes? If instead of asking how do people wash their clothes, ask how do people take care of their laundry? When you do that, you abstract the problem up one level. You go from what you know into what you don't know. You've abstracted it up. And what did P&G do when they came up with this question? They came up with this. Do you guys know what this is? This is an actual business project that they're prototyping. Tide dry cleaners. Instead of just focusing on the detergent, they're now focusing on cleaning your clothes. It's a bigger systemic problem. It's not just detergent, right? In architecture, you start to see this a little bit. Instead of asking what is possible, is it a building? You start to get projects like this. This is the High Line in New York, where you start to rethink what is possible, right? The second thing you want to do is define your terrain and then define the territory that you will carve out. Do you guys know, has anyone seen this? What is it? Rural Studio. So this is a chapel done by Sam Mockbee in Rural Studio in Alabama. Sam Mockbee knows his terrain. He knows the people that he works with. He works with the people to build his architecture. This is what he was famous for. Right? When you know your terrain, you can take a humble cup of coffee and say, what do people drink coffee for? You can say, okay, you drink coffee to meet with people, you drink coffee to work outside the office, and you drink coffee to entertain yourself and other friends, yes? When you know those terrains, you can start to build a new business model on coffee. And you can take that humble coffee, which used to sell for 50 cents, and upsell it for $2. So when you go to Starbucks and pay those $4 for those caramel, pumpkin macchiato, that's rotting out your teeth, sorry. what you're paying for is this knowledge, right? And when you do this, when you map out your terrain, you can also start to see new competition. Within the terrain of entertaining myself and meeting with friends, iTunes is a player, or Netflix is a player. And instead of competing with them, you can bring them into your fold. So what did Starbucks do? They sell iTunes cards in their stores. And they work with hotels to build Starbucks in their hotel chains. So you start to build an amazing array of business strategy by knowing your terrain. The next question you want to ask is, are you centered around your user? Right? Do you know your user as much as you know your artifact? So what we do is we do something, we have lots of methods, but one of the methods we do is immersion research. When you think of shopping, you think of the shop. When we think of shopping, we think of everything that you do to get to the shop. When did you make the decision to buy that beer? Right? What are the things that you went through to get to that shop? And because you know all that, you know your users so much that you're able to build better for them. You guys probably don't know this person. This person is an amazing architect who's pretty unknown. His name is Laurie Baker. And Laurie Baker is an English architect who came to India and settled in India. This guy, he's fully trained as a professional architect, never drew drawings. What he would do is, when a client came to him, he would say, okay, go back home and let me, next week you can expect me. Right? He would go 1 week later and stay with them for a whole 2 weeks in their house and observe them as they went about their life. And then he would go out into the site without drawings. He would make these sketches and show it to the artisans, and they would build these amazing vernacular structures. This is in the 1990s. This is not old architecture. This is 1990s that he was doing this. When you know your user, you can break down their behaviors into component parts, and you can start to design for it. This is Rem Koolhaas's project at IIT. When he designed this project, he started to look at how users move through, how students move through the campus. So instead of just charting out a site map and building a building, he mapped out usage patterns and then used the same usage patterns to construct his corridors that went into the building. And when you know your users, you can start to think big, right? You don't have to stop at a product level. You can, when you know your products, you can build systems. When you know your system, you can change organization. You guys know this is what happens. When you start moving upwards, you start to get this amazing array of intelligence, but also business insight and decision making that you can do. You guys know this? Everybody has one in their house? Yes? For centuries, well, maybe not centuries, but like for decades, this thing didn't change until these guys came by. You all know this? This is Nest. Nest is an interconnected thermostat. They said that if you take the regular thermostat and build information into it, you can start to get an amazing array of usage patterns, right? So you can build automation. You can start to build a system of devices that can control your entire house rather than just a mechanism to control your temperature. And finally, my favorite one, prototype, fail, repeat. You cannot build one artifact and be done. You have to continue to build these artifacts, test them with users, fail, test them with users again, fail, test them with users again. The primary purpose of a prototype is to fail. If your prototype or your model does not fail, that is not a prototype. You have just taken what is in your head and constructed a sketch of it, right? It's a validation prototype. It is validating what you already know. So at Chicago, we do amazing array of prototypes. So this is a prototype. So this is a project that we did. This is State and Madison, which is 00 for the addressing scheme for Chicago. So we'll do these little interventions in Chicago with the city of Chicago to test out little ideas about what we might do. So in this case, there's a physical rendering, the physical structure, which you can see, but there's also a virtual structure built on the narratives of the people who come to that place that is happening at the back end. So we'll run these prototypes, they'll fail, then we'll run another set of prototypes, they'll fail, and with every version of this, we are learning, right? And what this results in is what is known as placemaking. Instead of just thinking of an artifact, you can think of what behaviors your artifact enables. So this is courtesy of Gensler. These are 5 strategies for placemaking, where you don't think of spaces, but you think of the behaviors that they enable. So the first strategy is to contain these behaviors. So think Bryant Park, or think Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, where people are contained and there's an experience that's built because of that. The other strategy is to elevate. Think Highlight, or the 606 in Chicago is elevating these behaviors. Taking something that already existed, is pretty run down, and changing it. The other one is, next one is called focus, where you build something that is at a micro scale that users can use or see, but then it focuses energy into that. So the bean, or this is another one of our projects called the eye, where we put a big, massive eye, a bloodshot eye in the middle of Chicago. And it was pretty awesome because that everybody's energy was focused there. Good, bad, ugly, we got a lot of bad press, but still it was focused. Or you've seen this is Guggenheim Bilbao, where they put a puppy made of flowers. Right? Isn't that amazing? Flowers, puppy, put them together, puppy made of flowers. Right? You can activate a space. Times Square in New York, they activated it. Or this is a project in Versailles, I always get that name wrong, Versailles, Paris, where they put a mirror. Anytime you put a mirror anywhere, in your bathroom, in your front room, suddenly that place seems elevated, right? Like all of a sudden people want to play, people want to do things with it. And this is a project that's pretty impressive though. Or you can iconify. Some examples of iconification are the London Eye, for example, or the Marina project in Singapore, where they really made it big and massive. So if you're sitting in that infinity pool on the top, you can imagine what that feels like. Right? So what we're doing in Chicago is trying to take this and trying to build our own strategies around it. So we work with a group called Chicago Loop Alliance. We work with a lot of groups. One of them is Chicago Loop Alliance. We work with the City of Chicago. We work with the Department of Cultural Affairs and so on. And we build these prototypes, light, cheap, fast prototypes to test out ideas of placemaking. So this is a project that we've done recently called Activate. When you've been to Chicago, and this is why I keep referencing Chicago, have you seen the alleys? The alleys behind the buildings? These are the dead spots, right? These are the spots where nothing happens. So what Chicago Loop Alliance did is, why is nothing happening in these alleys? These are amazing places. Let's start prototyping some things in this. So they started to prototype some ideas in this. Then we take that, so in that process, we take old assets and build new place on it, right? So we start to get some interesting interactions with people. And this includes not just people, but also technology and computing and art.
We are in an alley, which is freaking awesome. It's a great event for the Loop. It's really showing people that the Loop is an awesome place to hang out after work and after dark.
I think it's like so many people go to a museum to look at art, and it's like very formal, and it's cool just to be around people, have fun, and just be in a new environment.
There's a giant bouncy pen thing behind me. There's a DJ booth. There are murals. There are performances. things on and light up pads.
I just love, especially when it's art, it inspires me as an artist.
Oh my gosh, this is fabulous.
DJ and some nice beer and wine and some agreed exhibit in the very back there. It's very nice.
What is Chicago? Is it buildings? Is it streets? Is it steel? Is it glass? Or is it all of that and this energy? If you cannot capture that energy, then you haven't captured or you haven't built architecture, right? Yeah. So we do more prototypes like this. So we learn from our prototypes and we build other prototypes. So this is another one that we're doing now. It's called aggregation, to test out aggregation instead of curation. So the last one was about curating pieces. So you bring people in and then you curate that experience. What if your city spoke to you, right? So this is a project called City Seats, and these seats move around in the city and they'll tweet where they are. So every day they have a different location, nobody knows where they are, but then they tell you where they are through Twitter. What happens to architecture when you start changing it, right? When you start rethinking its construct. So this is what we are trying to think about. This is what we are trying to do that goes beyond just thinking of the artifact. So these are just baby steps, clearly, right? We have not even reached a place where we can say we have arrived, but it allows us to ask this question. As you go out for your Thanksgiving break, maybe this is something to think about. Who is an architect? Right? The people who build that alley, that's Gensler. The architecture firm designed that alley. What is architecture? Thank you. So,
well, obviously, those are some provocations that I'm pretty sure got us all thinking. So let's have the questions. Who wants to have the first one? There we go, Dave. All right.
Why do you think Google Glass will fail?
Google, like all good companies should do, does not care if their technology succeeds. What they do is they build prototypes and test it. But because they have so much money, they can test it in the real world, which we can't do, right, with lots of money. So I'll give you another example of a failure that Google built on. There was a project called Google Wave. Then there was a project called Google Voice. Has anyone used any of these products? Google Voice? How many people have used Google Voice? So what Google Voice did is, what did it do? And then it did something else, right? It had voicemail, and then it would transcribe the voicemail, and then you had to go in and correct things, right? Or you could. So one of the things they did is they released these products. Google Voice was essentially, they knew they were going to release Google Now 5 years from then, but they knew that their voice systems weren't great. So they released Google Voice, got human beings to give them free service by correcting their voice mechanisms. So it would do voicemail recognition, and then you would go in and say, no, that's not what it said this. And then they build those algorithms into the system so that now you have an amazing, Google is by far the best voice recognition system in all the 3 platforms, right? Better than Siri and better than Cortana. The reason they do that. So they don't really care if Google Glass succeeds. All they care is 2 things. One, we move from this level, which is completely a business that is powered by Apple, to this level, which now anybody can play in, right? And second, they test out a technology and see if there's appreciation for it. So that's why I think it'll fail. It's a prototype. It's a very expensive prototype, but it's a prototype. But when you're $300 billion, you can do expensive prototypes. But how, you don't know if anything is viable. Only thing you can do is prototype it and test its viability. Google doesn't know if it is viable, but if it did succeed, you guys know what this is? Does anyone know what this is? This is the Microsoft Band. The Microsoft Band came out 1 month ago. Microsoft made, the rumor is that they made only 5,000 of these. And they sold out, right? They sold out within 2 weeks. It wasn't even available. Now they know the viability of this, and they can now invest more money into this. So now they're releasing more. So I think personally, that's the best way to do this, especially if you have lots of money, right? Test out, release something, test it, let it fail, learn from it, build something better. Yes.
It's obvious that technology, IT is going to change, is changing people's behavior. I'm not very clear though how this is going to transform architecture. If you think this is going to be a radical transformation or maybe just an overlay like Starbucks, your Starbucks example where you can create multiple activities, but maybe the physical space doesn't change substantially. Is that a possibility?
Yes, absolutely. I actually am a big believer that physical changes very, very slowly. So our cities take hundreds of years to change. So the actual form of the city may not change, but the way people perceive the city is going to change. Even though we like to think that the city is built off the physical structures, the reality is, so my favorite example in this is, you remember the old adage, if these walls could talk? Have you heard of this? If these walls could talk? I think we are at that point where we can enable that. And I think what's going to happen is that these walls that we construct are no longer just going to be perceived as physical structures anymore, but also as information structures, and layers and layers and layers of this information that we can sort of poke into and derive. So for my 4.5-year-old daughter, she cannot remember a world without the internet. She goes into a book, and you may have heard this before, but this is something she does. She takes a picture book and she goes, Papa, this is broken. Right? She doesn't know a world without information. So what happens? I mean, for her, everything is information. She doesn't know a world without free information also, which is another big problem, which we won't talk about today. Other questions?
In the case of, for us students and in the stage where we do not have necessarily the means to prototype certain things, how do you start to experiment and actually question certain forms in the built environment as prototypes?
Why do you not have place to prototype? You just told me you're going to put it up in your structure in the middle of downtown.
Yeah, that was one of the few times, but touché.
but this is the problem. I think the issue is we have been taught that prototypes have to look beautiful, right? They have to be validation of our thought processes, but they don't have to be. That is only a mindset that we can get over. Once we get over that mindset, you can build pretty ugly prototypes. So Andrew and I were walking around the building and we saw this line of people waiting to use the laser cutter today. Larry and I, in 2002, would have paid people money to use the laser cutter. We bought this expensive technology and we were paying people money to use it, right? There's no way that these mindsets are broken if you don't force people to break it, right? We would have given anything to have people do that. So we were prototyping things even before schools of architecture had started to understand what 3D printing and laser cutting were. But if we didn't do that, we wouldn't fail, and the investments would have gone, in different directions. So I think you need to get over this idea that you only need to make beautiful prototypes. make ugly prototypes. Some of our prototypes that we put out onto the streets, half the time they don't work. But the city of Chicago, I'll tell you, is pretty amazing. They're very supportive of this kind of prototype. They will pay you money, very little money, but they will pay you money to test these things out. And because of that, they are learning. But on the other hand, they're also putting in dangerous, complex systems. Do you guys know about Chicago's black box system? Chicago is putting around the city a set of black boxes that is powered by Cisco that will track activity, both human and pollution and environmental activity around the city. This is 1984. Right? This is the beginning of 1984. So on one end, they're prototyping with the dangerous stuff, and the other hand, they're paying us $2 to prototype something on the street. Right? So they're paying Cisco $1 million, and they're paying us $20 to do something. But they're prototyping constantly.
When do you then know where you have actually reached a conclusion? Or
what phone do you use?
A burner phone. Nokia. I don't know, Lumia.
Okay, how many people use? That's not a good phone. How many people use an iPhone? Okay. Do you remember iPhone? The first iPhone that came out? Does anyone remember the first iPhone? Did anyone buy the first iPhone? Yes? Michelle, you bought it. Do you remember how crappy it was? Yeah? Do you know what Apple does? They don't sell products. They sell prototypes. And you are their testers. iPhone 1 was a prototype for iPhone 3G. iPhone 3G was a prototype for iPhone 4. There are no products. There are only prototypes. Think about that. There is no product. Everything that you use is a prototype. Yes?
Thank you. The human experience relative to landscape, and I'm talking about living landscape, not man-made or prototyped or conceptually articulated landscape. So in the case of the evolution of architecture, where does a child in the landscape fit in? Where does an adult in the landscape fit in? Where do we recharge ourselves as creatures who live on a planet that's made of landscape? Does that fit into your world at all, anywhere? Or your child's, for that matter?
Yes. So you're talking about physical foliage and fauna, flora, yes? Yeah. So I think that, yes, I believe that one of the things that we have is this amazing ability to have our perspective of information, irrespective of how wrong it is, validated. Does that make sense? Irrespective of how micro-tiny our view of the world is, our perspective is always validated because that information exists and that information is available. I think what we have available is an ability to understand systems that are not man-made in much better perspective than we can now, because we can make visible those invisible relationships and challenge some of those deep-rooted ideas that we have about these systems that are wrong. Things like climate change, things like what is the effect of the man-made concrete island, right? We can start. So for example, Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill is an architecture firm in Chicago that did this really beautiful carbon footprint of Chicago and its effect on that ecosystem. Now, once you have that and you make that visible to everybody living there, that changes behavior. I like to think that my daughter is moving into a world where she can walk into the city and start to see the interconnections between living, non-living, and artificial information. I think she can see it. We don't have that ability yet. We're moving in that direction. There are people working on it, but we don't have it. But I like to think that's where my daughter is going into. So can you, like, for example, imagine the ability to see this living, breathing experience that landscape provides for us. That is beyond just the, oh, let's call a landscape architect to make it beautiful. Right? That's not the relationship. The relationship is there are transactions that is taking place, and we can see those transactions. At least I like to think so. Does that help?
Where your discussion on place at the beginning introduced this notion that some kind of algorithm between space as a physical construct and then place as an event-based
experience-based,
right? Experience-based. I find that people in the deep landscape actually are not able to understand it at a level which you're hoping for, and I think your hope is very beautiful, and I hope your hope is right. But it requires quite a bit of immersive experience in environments to be able to interpret them like that. And if we limit the access to those raw environments, we may actually compromise the ability to interpret them, just because the experience.
But aren't we already limiting those accesses now?
Actually, we're trying to increase those accesses now. I think that's the movement that's afoot in biophilia and all these.
That's great.
The No Child, what is it? In the Woods, the Richard Lau and all these. So there's a reaction there that your presentation, doesn't pull in, and it would be really interesting to know that. As all of the architecture, technology, and human interaction moved forward, so did our deep connection with nature.
That's great. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think maybe you're right, that maybe I should expand on that.
It'd be interesting to see how you would achieve the hope that you have for your, that you're saying for your child.
So we're working on prototypes for that as well. So we are pulling together. So we can do, at this moment, we can do place markers, and those place markers can have information built into it that's based on expertise, right? So we can have landscape architects or horticulturists or environmental scientists building information systems based on these place markers that allow people to negotiate that space in relation to the space that they're in. But again, baby steps, nothing to show yet. But yes, the possibility is there.
Could you comment on what seems to be an ethical differential potential when you're prototyping a product like an iPhone, selling it for, let's say, $600? If it doesn't quite work right, you have irritation that would be the result. And prototyping a building that might be $6 million or more with 1,000 people daily. Sort of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so when we talk about system level prototypes, we don't build the whole system. We build parts of the system, we understand the relationship between those parts, then increase those relationships as we get more validation for the assumptions that we've made. So I'll give you a simpler example, not quite a $6 million building, but let's say a $500,000 McDonald's, I know this is going to freak people out a little bit, but $500,000 McDonald's interaction. One of the things partners we work with is McDonald's. And if you think about what McDonald's does, is they don't serve food, they give you service, right? So they are basically doing service design. They're not doing retail design. So what we do is we break that service down into component parts, products, experiences, communications, messages, interactions, environments, people, and so on, right? And then we prototype the relationship between those parts. And then we say, okay, we are happy with where this is at this moment, and then we build a bigger system. And then we build a bigger system, and then we build a bigger system. And we embed that into the context in which it will be used. So McDonald's in India, for example, prototyped a completely different model for food. So when you walk into a McDonald's in India, and this caught me by surprise, the person behind the counter will say namaste. How many times have you walked into a McDonald's in the US and someone said namaste or anything? They would be just throwing food at you. But you can prototype those systems by breaking them into component parts. So that's how we prototype urban interactions. Like taking small parts, saying there's a product here, there's a communication here, there's an interaction here. Let's put those three together and prototype that. Then put that into a bigger system and a bigger system and so on.
More questions? So throw them up there. Larry? Others, please be ready with your questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture. A couple things. I know you have a long-range vision for like global impact, let's say in developing countries, specifically India, of course, your home. And what are your current thoughts about information impact in terms of education, housing, economic development in developing countries right now? Information. What's your current thinking?
Well, two things. One is we can't be myopic about these systems anymore, right? India this year is going to be the have the second largest internet users after the US. China is already like zooming away like crazy. So we're going to have information systems in place. If you travel outside the US, you will actually realize that the US is pretty archaic in its technology. If you use mobile phone technology in Europe and in Asia, those systems are far more advanced than the US systems. So what does this mean? This, in terms of education, for example, this is something we are grappling with, and I'm sure you guys are grappling with at the decision level, at the administrative level too, is things like edX. When you have free courses that's broadcast over the internet, what MIT does with edX or MITx is they'll broadcast their courses, and then if you can crack their courses and get a good grade in it, they will offer you admission, right? This is completely a reverse model of what universities used to do. So last year, there was this kid from Nepal who got into MIT, but this guy was based in a mountain region in Nepal. There's no way this kid could have gotten a scholarship into MIT if he hadn't cracked a couple of MIT courses. It's changing the way we think about education, I think. I mean, housing and, these are things that I'm not experts in, so I would probably not be able to talk as much, but I can't imagine that they are very different or very far away before, the developing world sort of catches up too. At least that's my point of view.
Thanks, Anijo, for the talk. I'm struck with the picture of the little girl with the laptop in India. I was just wondering, what's your thoughts about how to deal with poverty and technology in that kind of context? It's sort of like, we know what they got wrong, but how could they have gotten it right?
So for me, so from an abstracted level, I don't know what Negroponte could have done right. I know from an abstracted level that he was focused on computers when computing was the solution. Half the time, we build buildings when living is the solution, or seats when seating is a solution. So I think we just need to abstract that level up, but I don't, honestly speaking, I have no idea how he could have solved it. In other parts of the world, they've solved it by building very complex economic, political, and social relationships to one laptop per child. In Haiti, for example, there is no dropping from the helicopters. It is the government that works with Negroponte to give these laptops out. They build systems within schools where they can leave the laptops and they're locked up. There's all sorts of systemic solutions that they've thought out and prototyped. But this is the epic challenge that we are so this is what Guillermo, we were just talking to the dean about this. This is what we are capable of. We are capable of solving epic challenges like that. We are capable of solving housing. We're capable of solving education. We're capable of solving healthcare. This is what designers are capable of, right? And yet, we leave it to our business brethren We leave it to our engineering brethren to solve these problems, right? I think there's a big role to play. And I think that shift has to come. It is coming. There is a movement within design where everything is moving up from the artifact. But I think that's what if there's nothing that you take away from this session, take this away. Don't take a problem as a given. Always abstract it up once, right? If you are given this problem of building something, ask the question, is a building the solution? Is that what users want, right? And then go in and find out what users want, and then abstract that.
I love the example of when you were in the alleyway and everyone was there, and obviously the people there weren't all designers or architects. And if you're trying to solve all these issues using computers and social media, and everyone can share information with each other just by clicking a button that says share, why hasn't it caught on more than it has already?
So which one are you talking about?
The alleyway when you were activating the space.
Right.
I mean, if people are going to share this information with each other, why aren't there more examples of this around? Are people just maybe not caring as much, or do they not take the time?
You mean alley activation type things? We are actually franchising that model out to other cities now. So there is this, so other cities have gotten, seen it on social media. The speed at which information moves is unbelievable, right? Before you do it, so China, which is a country that is really very good at blocking the traditional media sources, what they would do is if a newspaper would print something bad about them, they would cut that newspaper off. That traditional media was amazingly easy for them to block. Then came Twitter. They couldn't handle the speed at which people were tweeting. So much so that when the earthquake happened in China, they had to basically shut down the internet so that information wasn't coming out, right? So what we are finding is that even before we can put out a press release, even before we can do something, someone in Detroit is already asking us, hey, can we do this in Detroit? So it's actually, I mean, the speed is amazing, but the velocity, the volume isn't that much yet. But I think it's just a matter of time, personally.
So you mentioned the difference between your prototypes on the street and the black boxes kind of spectating all the people and all the information and stuff. How do designers play a role in keeping the information age from becoming like obstructive and being more free-flowing and kind of flowing from the people versus, do designers play that role?
Yes, good question. This is something that we are trying to do now. The second and the third waves of design was very successful in changing the business mindset about design. So now business, thanks to Steve Jobs, knows the value of design, right? They know they can make money out of it. The fourth wave of design is now trying to change policy mindset. So we're now working with actual policymakers. So I work directly with the mayor's office in Chicago. We are working with the Planning Commission in India to bring in design research and design thinking. And there's all sorts of moves happening everywhere. So this is not pervasive yet, but if you have ever been to a TSA officer recently, you will notice that there is a significant change in their behavior. They're a little bit more friendly, as much friendly as they can get. One of the reasons for that is an IDEO study that IDEO did with the Transportation Authority and basically evaluated their systems, they evaluated their users, and then they went in and they said, what is your purpose? What do you do? And the TSA officers said, we look for hostile objects, right? And that's what they do, yes? That's what they do when they search your bag and they put you up. And then IDEO said, what is your purpose? Their purpose, IDEO said, isn't to search for hostile objects, but to search for hostile intent. This is a significant difference from what they've been doing. Because they didn't understand their purpose, they hadn't abstracted it up one level, they kept searching for hostile objects. In that process, made everybody hostile. right? So instead of finding that one person who has an hostile intent, they were made everybody hostile, so everybody looked like a criminal to them. So by building these layers of design thinking upstream in the policy level, we're starting to change policy. We're starting to make differences at the government level too. But these are old organizations. They take years of, there's years of stratification. There's years of thinking that is built into it. Think of all the politics you have to navigate before you can get anything done. I'm amazed you guys are still here. That's great.
All right, one last question. Who wants to have it? You can prototype a question. We have learned that, right? Well, let me just ask the question then, and let's just first say that, Anijo, that you've given us a lot of, you've reframed a lot of things, let's put it that way. Okay. So you've practiced what you have just mentioned to us, which is reframing a number of things, right? What is architecture? And one of the important things you said is often we zero up on nouns or objects, things, but that you need to think about verbs, the ing forms, as a process. So focusing on process, I'm reminded of Louis Kahn's distinction between architecture and building. And he understood very well a long time ago when people talked about architecture, they confuse it with building. And that buildings are things, but architecture is a body of knowledge, set of relationships and processes that underlie and animate all of these things and actually bring meaning to it, which is really in the broader sense of what you have talked about. So that is, and I think Jody has also raised an interesting question about the notion of nature and how that might be reframed, or being reframed, as you pointed out as well. So let me just ask that, what does it mean for architectural education? You have education in architecture and beyond. So what are your thoughts on what should we be looking out for to reframe and to relearn? What are your thoughts about how we can reform, perhaps?
Are you sure you want to go this route?
Sure, let's go. That means it was not a bad question.
I'm okay. So I think and I'm sorry if I offend anyone in the audience, but I think the profession is the biggest detriment to the education of architecture. I think we educate people to work in offices. We don't educate people to think big. And I think that is a problem. And personally, that has always been our little prototype at Mississippi, is nudge it a little bit to say, okay, what are we doing beyond drafting and making the next best 3D model and making the next best Mazda city and the next best Bilbao? What are we doing beyond that? What the hell are we doing to change this world? What is our legacy as architects? I don't think we are educating that thought process. Other disciplines are. Other disciplines are asking people to think big, right? And we are not. And I think we should. And I think the profession is holding us back. I'm sorry, this is a can of worms that probably should be open, but I think we should rethink the power that the profession exerts over education. That's my simplest, probably controversial response.
All right, I asked for it. So I think that is indeed the discussion that has been going on out in the profession and in education world. Just to wrap it all up, just 2 weeks ago, where Michelle and I and others were present, the discussion about that is going on. So there's a lot of questions being raised. So I think that bodes well for it.
That's great.
And so on that note, we would like to thank Anijo. Let's give him a good round of applause. And he's trying to activate the alleyway of time space in between, Thanksgiving and finals and all that. So thanks for activating us.
Off to your turkeys. Go.
And thank you all for showing up as well.